Picture the most important moment in human history. Not the invention of writing, not the wheel, not gunpowder or the printing press or the splitting of the atom. This, a field. A human being kneeling in the soil of what is now southern Turkey or northern Iraq or the Jordan Valley, pressing a seed into the ground, deliberately, with intent, and then waiting. This moment, repeated independently across at least 5 or 6 different regions of the world over a period of a few thousand years, is what we call the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution, the single greatest transformation in how human beings live. It gave us food security, population growth, surplus, trade, specialization, art, government, civilization in every sense of the world. And it gave us something else, something nobody planned for. Nobody wanted, something that would go on to kill more human beings than every war in history combined. It gave disease a home. Welcome back to The Silent Machine. This is episode 2. This is the price of civilization. To understand what farming did to human health, you first have to understand what came before it. For the first 190,000 years of our existence as a species, human beings were hunter-gatherers. Mobile, dispersed, living in small bands rarely exceeding 50 people, ranging across enormous territories, following game and seasonal plant resources. This lifestyle had costs. It was physically demanding. There was real hunger in lean seasons. Violence between groups was not uncommon. But from the perspective of infectious disease, and particularly epidemic disease, it had one critical advantage that we have almost entirely lost: space. When you live in a group of 25 people spread across hundreds of square kilometers, your exposure to other humans is limited. Your exposure to their pathogens is limited. And critically, if a fast-moving, highly contagious disease arrives in your group, it has a ceiling. It can infect 25 people. Then it runs out of hosts. It burns out. It dies. The group moves on. Epidemiologists call this the minimum viable population threshold. For measles, one of the most contagious diseases we know of, you need a continuously replenished population of roughly 250,000 to 500,000 people living in close contact to sustain the virus indefinitely. Hunter-gatherer bands didn't come close to that number, not even close. So the diseases that ravage cities, the epidemic diseases, the crowd diseases, the plagues that tear through dense populations like fire through dry grass, simply could not exist in a world of nomadic bands. Then, the band stopped moving, and everything changed. The Neolithic Revolution did not happen everywhere at once. It happened in waves. In the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, wheat, barley, lentils, and chickpeas were under cultivation by 9500 BCE. In China, rice and millet by 7000 BCE. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. In the Americas, independently, maize, squash, beans. Wherever it happened, the same pattern followed: permanent settlements, storage of food, a surplus that meant not everyone had to farm, which meant some people could do other things: make pottery, trade, govern, fight. The division of labor that underpins every civilization that has ever existed. And alongside the crops came the animals: goats, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, dogs, donkeys, tamed, penned, living in close daily contact with human populations. Let me be very precise about what this means biologically. Before farming, a human being might encounter a wild animal. Hunt it, kill it, butcher it. Contact brief, intense, repeated rarely. After farming, a human being lives within meters of the same animals, every day for their entire life. Their children grow up next to those animals. Their waste contaminates the same water supply. Their breath fills the same air. The barrier between animal pathogens and human hosts, a barrier that evolution had maintained through physical separation across hundreds of thousands of years, was gone. Not breached, not weakened, gone. Çatalhöyük, southern Turkey, 7100 BCE. One of the world's oldest known proto-cities. At its peak, home to between 3,500 and 8,000 people, pressed into a dense tangle of mud brick dwellings with no streets between them. You moved through Çatalhöyük by walking across the rooftops and dropping through ceiling hatches into your home below. Your neighbors' walls were your walls. Their waste was your waste. Their air was your air. Scientists have spent 25 years studying the human remains buried at Çatalhöyük because these people buried their dead underneath the floors of their own homes. The dead lay directly beneath where the living slept, and what those remains tell us is sobering. Published findings from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences report that the longer Çatalhöyük was occupied, the worse the health of its residents became. Over the nearly 1,200 years of the settlement's continuous occupation, from 7100 to 5950 BCE, bioarchaeologists tracked a clear pattern: increasing evidence of infectious disease in the bones, rising markers of developmental stress in the teeth, and growing signs of overcrowding in the skeletal record. Up to 1/3 of remains from the settlement's later period show evidence of infection on their bones. 1/3. This was not a diseased slum. This was one of the most successful, most prosperous, most sophisticated human settlements on Earth at the time, and it was making its residents sick. The city was the disease vector.
Here is a term you need to know: zoonosis. A zoonotic disease is any disease that originates in an animal and can be transmitted to a human host. The word comes from the Greek, zoon, animal, nosos, disease. It is not a rare or exotic category. Roughly 60% of all known infectious diseases that affect human beings are zoonotic in origin, and approximately 75% of all emerging infectious diseases, the new diseases that appear in human populations, cross to us from animals. Zoonosis is not the exception, it is the rule. And the Neolithic Revolution did not create zoonotic disease. Animals and humans had been sharing pathogens at the point of contact during hunting, butchering, consuming for hundreds of thousands of years. What the Neolithic Revolution did was industrialize it. Brucellosis, caused by the bacterium Brucella melitensis, is one of the oldest confirmed zoonotic diseases in the human archaeological record. Research published in a model informed by data from Neolithic goat populations in the Fertile Crescent show that Brucella could have been sustained in early domestic goat herds continuously, passing from animals to humans through contact with milk, blood, and birthing fluids for as long as those goats were kept. Meaning, from the moment you penned a goat, you potentially gave Brucella a permanent address. And Brucella was just the opening act. Tuberculosis, anthrax, influenza, smallpox, measles. Every one of them has animal origins. Every one of them used the same gateway: the domesticated animal, living in the shadow of a human settlement, passing its pathogens across the species barrier day after day, year after year, generation after generation, until a mutation arrived that allowed the pathogen to spread not just from animal to human, but from human to human. That is the moment a zoonotic disease becomes an epidemic, and once that threshold is crossed, there is no going back.
Let's be absolutely direct about this. Smallpox, the disease that killed an estimated 300 to 500 million people in the 20th century alone before eradication in 1980, almost certainly evolved from a pox virus carried by cattle or rodents. Tuberculosis, one of the top 10 causes of death worldwide even today, is caused by a bacterium closely related to Mycobacterium bovis, cattle tuberculosis. The molecular evidence suggests the two split from a common ancestor within the context of early animal domestication. Influenza, the virus that caused the 1918 pandemic and has killed millions across dozens of outbreaks, is a bird disease, specifically wild waterfowl. It moves into domestic chickens and pigs, where it adapts and recombines, and periodically leaps into human populations in forms our immune systems have never encountered. And measles. Measles is perhaps the most instructive case of all. We know from molecular clock analysis published in Science in 2020 that the measles virus diverged from rinderpest, a cattle virus, at some point around the 6th century BCE. The divergence coincided precisely with the rise of the first urban populations large enough to sustain the virus indefinitely, cities of roughly 250,000 to 500,000 people. Before cities reached that size, measles as we know it could not exist as a human disease. It needed too many hosts. The population wasn't there. Once the population was there, the virus arrived to fill the gap, as if it had been waiting. It had been, in the cattle, for thousands of years. Farming didn't just feed human civilization, it armed its enemies.
There is another dimension to the story that deserves its own moment: water. In a nomadic existence, your water source changes constantly. You move from river to river, pool to pool. You are not drinking from the same source that 100 other people and their animals have been fouling for 10 years. Settle in one place, and that calculation inverts completely.
A permanent settlement means a permanent water source, which means everything the community produces, human waste, animal waste, agricultural runoff, the dead bodies of diseased animals, stays in the immediate environment. The water table absorbs it. The river carries it downstream to the next community. The well is shared by everyone. Waterborne diseases, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, hepatitis A, are not ancient in origin, but they are ancient in the sense that permanent settlement made them structurally inevitable. You cannot have 1,000 people sharing a single water source without contamination. The physics don't allow it. The microbiology doesn't allow it. You can dig your latrines further from the well. You can bury your dead further from the river. And Neolithic people, we have evidence to suggest, sometimes tried. But the density of the settlement works against you at every turn. Modern sanitation, the technology that finally severed the link between human waste and human drinking water, was not engineered until the mid-19th century. Which means that from roughly 10,000 BCE until roughly 1850 CE, for nearly 12,000 years, every settled human community on Earth was to varying degrees drinking its own contaminated history. Every generation, without exception.
In 2015, a team of ancient DNA researchers led by evolutionary biologist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen was studying the teeth of 101 Bronze Age individuals from across Europe and Asia. They were looking for the origins of early European migrations. They found something else entirely. In the dental pulp of 7 ancient individuals buried in Russia, Estonia, Poland, and Armenia, spanning a period from 4,800 to nearly 3,000 years ago, they found Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. This was a staggering discovery. It meant plague had been present in human populations for at least 4,800 years, nearly twice as long as previously thought. But this early plague was different from the Black Death, critically different. The Bronze Age Yersinia pestis strains lack 2 key genetic features of the medieval plague: the Yersinia murine toxin gene, which allows the bacterium to survive in the gut of a flea, and the plasminogen activator gene, which gives the fully adapted strain its terrifying ability to spread through the lymphatic system and blood. This early plague was not flea-borne, it was not bubonic. Scientists believe it spread through direct contact, person to person, animal to person, in the pastoralist communities of the Eurasian steppe, and it traveled with those communities as they migrated. Between 5,000 and 4,800 years ago, the Yamnaya people, nomadic herders of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, swept westward into Europe in one of the most dramatic population movements in prehistory. They brought their culture, their Proto-Indo-European language, the ancestor of most of the languages spoken in Europe today, their horses, their cattle, and their plague. Ancient DNA evidence shows that around 75% of the genetic heritage of local Neolithic farmer populations in Central Europe was replaced by Yamnaya ancestry within a few centuries. 75%. Not gradual replacement. Massive, rapid demographic collapse. We cannot say with certainty that plague was her cause, but we know the plague was there, and we know the Neolithic farmers of Central Europe had no prior exposure to it. The pattern, a pathogen traveling with a migrating population into a naive host community, is one we will see again and again and again throughout this series. In 1520, it will be called the Columbian Exchange. Here, in 3000 BCE, it has no name, but the dead are still dead.
Let's talk about what Y. pestis actually does to a human body, because this is not abstract biology. This is what those Bronze Age pastoralists experienced. This is what the Neolithic farmers of Central Europe experienced when it arrived in their communities. Y. pestis is, by any objective measure, one of the most ingeniously dangerous pathogens that has ever existed. It begins by doing something almost inconceivable. It enters a macrophage, one of your immune system's primary weapons, a white blood cell specifically designed to engulf and destroy invading bacteria, and it survives inside it. Not just survives, it replicates. The macrophage, designed to destroy the pathogen, becomes the pathogen's vehicle. The immune system is not just outwitted, it is hijacked, turned into a taxi, and driven to the lymph node. In the fully adapted bubonic form, the lymph node swells into the notorious bubo, a grotesque, painful mass that can reach the size of an egg under the skin of the groin, armpit, or neck. In the earlier Bronze Age form, scientists believed the infection was slower, less dramatic in its presentation, but no less lethal. Once bacteria enter the bloodstream, septicemic plague, the mortality rate approaches 100% without modern intervention. The body's own inflammatory response, desperately trying to fight the infection, becomes the mechanism of destruction. The blood begins to clot in the vessels, tissue dies, organs fail. The skin blackens at the extremities as circulation fails. This is what dying of plague means at the cellular level. This is what was moving across the Eurasian steppe 5,000 years ago in communities that had no name for it, no treatment for it, and no way of understanding what was killing them. There is a footnote to the plague story that is almost too remarkable to be true.
In certain European populations, particularly Northern Europeans, there exists a genetic mutation called CCR5 delta 32. It is a deletion in the CCR5 gene, which codes for a receptor on the surface of white blood cells. People who carry 2 copies of this mutation, about 1% of people of Northern European descent, are highly resistant to bubonic plague. Their immune cells simply lack the receptor that Y. pestis exploits to gain entry. The mutation is thought to have been under strong positive selection during the major plague outbreaks of European history, meaning people who carried it survived at higher rates, had more children, and passed the mutation forward. Here is the part that should stop you cold. CCR5 delta 32 also provides near-complete resistance to HIV-1. The same deletion that blocks Y. pestis from entering immune cells also blocks the HIV virus from entering the same cells. People who carry 2 copies of this mutation cannot be infected by HIV-1 through normal routes. This is not a coincidence of mechanism. This is evolution. Centuries of plague pressure selected for a mutation in European populations, a mutation that 600 years later would also protect against a virus that would not exist in human populations until the 20th century. The plague built a shield that nobody knew they would need for a war that hadn't started yet. This is what it means to say that infectious disease drives human evolution. Not as metaphor, as literal, molecular, verifiable fact.
Here is a fact that tends to surprise people. In almost every measurable biological metric, the first farmers were less healthy than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Shorter, more prone to dental disease, because domesticated grain is full of fermentable carbohydrates that cause tooth decay, in ways that a varied wild diet does not. More prone to nutritional deficiency, because a diet dominated by 1 or 2 cultivated crops, however calorie-dense, lacks the nutritional breadth of a wide-ranging omnivore diet. More prone to infectious disease, more prone to growth disruption, visible in the enamel hypoplasia lines in their teeth, recording each episode of illness or malnutrition during childhood development. The anthropological record is consistent on this point across multiple regions of the world. When you look at the skeletal remains of early agricultural communities, in the Fertile Crescent, in Europe, in North America, you see the same story. The transition to farming was not immediately good for human bodies. It was good for populations. Total numbers went up, productivity went up, surplus went up. But for the individual inside that system, the person working the fields, tending the animals, drinking the shared water, sleeping next to the shared walls, life was harder, shorter, and sicker than it had been for their nomadic ancestors. The deal that humanity struck with civilization was not, you will live better. The deal was, there will be more of you. And in the arithmetic of evolution, that is sufficient. But the individual human beings who lived through that transition paid the price. In their bones, in their teeth, in their children's enamel, and in the plagues that were just beginning to find their form.
Everything we will cover in this series, every plague, every pandemic, every epidemic that has torn through human civilization traces a line back to this period, the Neolithic Revolution, 10,000 BCE. Not because disease did not exist before it, Episode 1 made clear that it did, but because the Neolithic Revolution changed the rules of the game fundamentally and permanently. It created density, it created the sustained contact between humans and animals that produces zoonotic spillover. It created the contaminated water infrastructure that made enteric disease endemic. It created the trade routes that would carry pathogens across continents. And it created the population sizes that allowed epidemic diseases, crowd diseases, to sustain themselves indefinitely in human populations for the first time. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2019, the 1918 Spanish flu, the Black Death of 1347, the plague of Justinian in 541. Every single one of these events has a direct biological line of descent from the moment a Neolithic farmer penned the first goat. Not figuratively, mechanistically. The virus that caused COVID-19 crossed from an animal reservoir to humans. The 1918 flu was a bird flu. The plague bacterium evolved in the rodent populations of the Eurasian steppe and spread along the trade routes created by agricultural civilization. We have never stopped living in the world that the Neolithic Revolution created. We have better medicine now, vastly better. We have antibiotics, vaccines, antivirals, sanitation, germ theory, intensive care units. We have tools that would seem miraculous to a Neolithic farmer. But we are still dense. We are still urban. We are still living with our animals, not goats in our houses, but chickens in their billions in industrial farming systems, pigs in confined feeding operations, bats roosting in markets where their guano falls on produce that people eat. The conditions that opened Pandora's box 10,000 years ago are not just still present, they are more extreme than they have ever been, and the pathogens are still paying attention.
That is the price of civilization. Not a metaphor, not a philosophical abstraction, a biological transaction made 10,000 years ago, whose terms have never been renegotiated. We got cities, we got writing, we got art and law and medicine, and the accumulated knowledge of 100 civilizations. Disease got density, it got water, it got trade routes, it got 10 billion hosts living in conditions that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. Both sides of that deal are still in effect. Next episode, Gods, Curses, and Contagion. The ancient world tries to make sense of what is killing it, and the answers it reaches are sometimes wrong, occasionally brilliant, and always human. Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, the first attempts at medicine, and the diseases that made it necessary. I'll see you there.